Thanks very much, first of all, for the invitation today. It's fantastic to be here. So, I mean, there's so much you could talk about in this topic. I can't cover everything, but I'm going to talk specifically about what we've done with lectures and considering whether or not this is going to be a passing fad. Are we just going to go back to where we were before COVID? Or actually, are we embarking on a new long-term trend? So, without further ado, I'll give you a bit of background to what we did. I'll talk about the online learning spectrum and where we currently sit. I'll then think about lectures. As I said, we'll think about whether doing these online is the way forward, or should we go back to doing in-person lectures again? What's the best way? And then just think a little bit about what might lie ahead. And I think that we're all going to be having to think about this quite a lot in the months to come as we get ready for whatever the new normal is going to be in future. So I always like to just start off with this, just that this is kind of what's driven my career. I'm a teaching focused academic. I was a school teacher before I came into the university. And I guess I always think about my teaching and how I can evolve it. And when we innovate, we don't just innovate for the sake of it. We normally have a problem we want to solve. And on this occasion, it was how do we move online rapidly when a pandemic strikes? Not something that many of us had planned for before. In doing that, there was a lot we could learn from other people. There was lots of prior literature on online learning, and we could use that to design, trial, and implement whatever it was that we wanted to put in place. I always think evaluation is really important because then we can reflect on what we've done and we can then change things for the next time around and continually improve our teaching. Now, I'm a chemist, and in the chemistry field, there's a lot of literature. If I just bring those up, we've got various journals and magazines we can go to. It will be the same in all disciplines. We've got conferences, such as the one we're at today, but many other educational conferences, and there's lots of stuff on Twitter. So we can learn from these sources to inform our practice. But if we do the evaluation well and reflect on it, we can also feed back into those conversations. We can generate new knowledge which other people can use. So I always encourage people to evaluate what they're doing and then share it with others. And that's got me to where I am. Anyway, so let's think about this online learning spectrum. So if we go back to pre-COVID, I don't think many of us really were completely face-to-face. For years now, we've had some degree of blended learning, even if it's just sharing resources online. But I think suddenly when the pandemic struck and we went into lockdown, we were here. We moved all the way over here. 10 years of innovation happened overnight. Before Christmas, we moved back to a kind of hybrid model at the University of Southampton. So we had some face-to-face teaching, but predominantly we were still teaching online. And I think we're going to be sort of fluctuating between different levels as we move through the changing period ahead. But the question is, where should we land at the end of all of this? Where do we want to be as a higher education sort of community? So just to think specifically about what we did, I teach on a program called the Science Foundation Year at Southampton. There's a lot of information on here. The main thing I want to focus on is that when lockdown struck, our lectures went entirely online. There are other aspects of our activity which were delivered online, but everything was underpinned by the lecture. If the students don't understand the basic content they need to engage with the other activities, then they're not going to get anywhere. So that's the thing that we focused on. How effective are our online lectures? Now, if we think about this scene, which you may well have seen before, this is like the classic picture of a lecture, if you like, that hasn't changed much in 1,000 years. So we have the person with all the knowledge at the front. We have a few very keen students sitting at the front. And as you go back through the lecture theatre, we can see that there are various different levels of inattention. We've got this guy over here who's even lost the will to live. And I think we've all had that experience in lectures at some point. So how effective is this traditional model of lectures anyway? I think that's a question we should have been asking for some time. This was actually brought home to me over 10 years ago at the conference. This is the Association for Learning Technology conference. This guy, Don Clark, was saying we shouldn't be using lectures anymore. His talk was called "Don't Lecture Me." And it was quite interesting that lots of academics were in the audience and were not very happy about what he was saying. That saying to academics not to do lectures is not necessarily a popular message. However, times are changing, and more I'm hearing my colleagues now saying, "Oh, maybe we shouldn't be doing lectures anymore." So time can be a real factor in this, but of course the experience of what's happened over the last year has influenced that somewhat. If we just think about the problems with lectures, I mean, obviously we have a lot of students and one staff member, a poor staff-student ratio. Lectures tend to be bombarding students with too much information. They tend to have poor note-taking skills. It's a very teacher-led experience, very passive for the students. Inconvenient times, well, 9 o'clock lectures, certainly in the UK, are not very popular, nor are the ones at 5 p.m. in the afternoon, so not always good times for students. And it's difficult to get group work and discussion, which is really important in terms of supporting learning. A real lack of dialogue from my perspective. And we've started to see, not really bad behavior like you'd see at school, but, students who are chatting and having conversations and not really concentrating in lectures, probably because of these problems here. So that certainly prompted us to ask this question. We've been recording lectures now for 10 years. So we wanted to see, do recorded lectures actually foster independent learning? And you can see here that students might work together, they could discuss concepts, they can pause the lecture, they can look in the textbook, they can generate much better notes perhaps than they would if they were sitting in a lecture theatre. And this was a quote from one of my students a few years ago, that online lecture recordings were the most helpful thing they'd ever experienced in education. But if you look at the statistics, and most online lecture platforms do give you viewing figures, if you like, sometimes you see students watching 8 hours of lectures in one day, thinking that knowledge is going to kind of go into their brain by osmosis, actually not appreciating that there's a process you have to go through to be able to consolidate that learning. So that this is like the Netflix effect, if you like, and perhaps some students are taking that approach to their online learning. So this is what we did. We took our lectures, and rather than delivering one 50-minute video, we broke them up into 3 smaller parts. Partly because students might have short attention spans. That's a bit controversial. Not everybody agrees with that point. But there was some research to back this up, although we have to be careful. There was this study which implied that lectures shouldn't be longer than, or videos shouldn't be longer than 6 minutes. They based this on the fact that when you had longer recordings, so you can see these are the recordings getting longer, the red line shows you the proportion of the video that students watched. So with the long videos, students were watching much less. However, this is not a peer-reviewed study. We need to be careful with that one. There is a process called segmenting, where you take content and break it up into smaller and smaller chunks. But the idea of that is that students then will, when they understand one piece, they themselves will move on to the next piece. And that's very laborious to set up. So there's some good evidence in the literature that that's a good approach, but it's not an easy one to do in practice. So we took a compromise approach, as I say, and we created our lecture recordings, which were 15 minutes or so in duration. So for example, this lecture was on electrochemistry. There were 3 parts that the students would watch, and they could do them anytime they wanted, and they could manage their pace through their own studies, unlike in a real lecture. After we've done this, as I said, evaluation is really important. So I'm going to share with you what our students told us about these different lecture recording features that we had. So what is the impact on your learning in comparison to a normal 50-minute face-to-face lecture? So we can see here in their responses, this was collected via a survey, that a majority of the students who responded said that this had a positive impact on their learning. Very few of them said that this was negative. Okay, so that's a good thing for us, but without knowing why, that doesn't really tell us very much. So we also have some qualitative data here. So why did students respond that way? Well, they like having control and flexibility. They can actually watch those lecture recordings at a time that works for them when they're fully engaged, which might not be 9 o'clock in the morning. They can take a break and think about the content before they move on to the next part, which of course you can't do if you're in the middle of a live lecture. If you're in a live lecture and you don't understand something very early on, then you could be lost for the whole of the rest of the session. Whereas when it's online, they can consolidate their learning before they move on. And of course, they can take notes in more detail because they can pause. They can write more stuff down, look at the textbook, go to the web for more material. So all of this helps them to be able to actually put together a better package of notes. So these were all positives. Another thing we did, as well as breaking our lectures up into shorter chunks, we also embedded quiz questions. So as you're watching the recording, the video will pause, a question will appear on the screen, and the students have to respond, just like you might do in a live lecture where you're asking questions of the students. This is based on research that's been done before. So people have shown in the past that you can see here, the green is showing that the learning gain for students that had quiz questions in their videos was higher than the learning gain for those that didn't. So there's evidence to back this up. There's more evidence here. And the tool that we use to record our lectures is called Panopto. Many other of the lecture recording tools will do the same thing. You can insert questions, as many as you want, into a lecture recording. So we found this very straightforward to do. And the really nice thing about this is that it would collect data. So we could see after the students had watched the recording, we can see their responses. I've hidden their names over here, but we can see which questions they're getting right and which questions they're getting wrong. And that can inform the support we put in place to help them. So this is a really useful way to see how the students are coping with the lecture material, if they're understanding it or not. So in fact, I feel I have more information doing this than I do when I'm teaching in a live lecture theatre. So what did the students think? We asked them, what do you feel is the impact on your learning of having these recordings with quiz questions in comparison to ones they'd seen previously? And again, we can see here, look, the positive impacts, blue and green, the overwhelming majority of students said this had a positive impact on their learning. And the things they were saying to us was it makes them think about and practice the topic during the learning. They feel more engaged. You can see if you don't understand something, and then you can go back and fix it before you move on. They said that when they had regular flip lectures that we delivered in the course of the year, they were never sure if they understood the material until the following lecture, but this was giving them a chance to test their understanding as they were working through the material. And here, this was saying that it gave them a sense of achievement and helped to motivate them. And I think that's really important, especially when you're studying online. So another thing that we did, so I'm just sharing with you the features here, things you might think about for moving your lectures online in the future. Another thing we thought was important was actually to put us in the picture so they could see us. And I'm a real fan. I have a whole tray, because I do lots of online teaching. I have a whole box of Molly mods here, pre-made to support my teaching. And I'm always waving these at the camera, as you can see I'm doing now. For chemistry, it's really important to be able to visualize concepts. So you can see that's an example of me there showing chirality and using the models to show the mirror images of the molecules here, which is an important concept in chemistry. So we have the talking head. So the student watching the recording can see the person who's doing the lecturing. Now, actually, if you look at the research on this, the benefits are, some people think that there are disadvantages to doing this, actually. Although the social cues you're using might help students to process material, it might be that they spend too much time looking at the lecturer, and that could actually increase their cognitive load. And that might then detract from learning. So what I found to be very useful, you can see my laser pointer here that I'm using on the screen. Actually, to make sure they're not focusing on me too much, I will wave the laser pointer around on the screen to focus their attention on the part of the screen that's most important to the thing they're learning. So you can use this to direct their attention. That's quite important. Anyway, so previously there's been no evidence that a talking head improves learning, but there has been evidence that it might impact on motivation. So what did our students think? Well, we asked them, what's the impact on your experience of having this talking head showing the lecturer in comparison to a lecture recording where there is no talking head? And the response again was overwhelmingly positive. So again, here we can see nobody has actually said anything negative about it. They were all very positive about it. You can see there's another example there. I think that's showing up okay on the screen, where I use my hands a lot to show molecules colliding. I am the kind of lecturer who's always waving my hands around. So if you didn't have the talking head, you lose that aspect of your teaching. So the things the students said were important here. So the presence of the instructor was important to them. It felt like I was actually in a lecture, so I was more motivated to work. It's nice to feel like a teacher is there. This was an interesting point, though. I found that although the talking head made the lectures seem more personal, I don't think it increased my understanding of the content. So, not everybody thinks that it's going to help their learning, but this was a person who thought it was a good idea to be able to see the lecturer. So I think it is important. A few of the students picked up on this idea of visualization in their responses. They said that the props used, i.e. the models, for example, are really useful for explaining the content and visualizing ideas. And this one, they commented on my hand gestures. It's beneficial for lecturers like David, who uses his hands when explaining the collision of molecules. That's a typo on the student's part. Or the transfer of electrons. I'm always showing electrons being transferred with motions like this. And that certainly has been something students have commented on positively. So that's three things that we did with our lecture recordings, and we saw the students were very positive about them. breaking the lectures up into shorter chunks, focusing more on concepts. Having the quiz questions that allow them to test their understanding as they work through the material, and then having the talking head, the picture of the person who's doing the lecturing and actually using hand gestures, models, and other techniques to try and show the students, help them to visualize the processes which are happening, which is so crucial in chemistry. So looking ahead, so I've been dabbling with this idea of flipped teaching for several years now. Flipped teaching is where you put your lectures online as recordings, and then you do different stuff in your face-to-face sessions. This is what we've effectively been doing here, although everything has been online. That's been the key change that we've had in the last year. But we thought we'd just ask the students, what did they think? After the pandemic, lecture material, we said, to what extent do you agree with this statement? Lecture material should continue to be provided in the current format, i.e. online mini lectures with quiz questions when we return to on-campus teaching. So these were students who had face-to-face lectures in the early part of 2019-20, and then they went online when the pandemic hit. So they'd experienced both environments. And the response was interesting. We can see that some students disagree, right? There's no doubt that some students would rather go back to us having face-to-face lectures. But a significant proportion of the students said that they would prefer it to stay the way it is now, online. That gives us a bit of a quandary here. What do we do? What's the best approach? Should we move it online? Should we keep it face-to-face? Or perhaps should we do a mixture of both? And that's where I would like to go in the future. I think you need to have the face-to-face. It's essential. But for that lecture content, maybe it's better for students to be able to work through it at their own pace. The things they told us were important here, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. In terms of why did they give the response to that previous question that we looked at, the students who were in favour said these were the benefits. I feel I understand the content better in online videos compared to face-to-face lectures. This was a student who told us they were pausing the video, they were looking at the textbook, they were writing more detailed notes than they normally would. They like the flexibility. So that some students prefer to study at home rather than face-to-face. Now, actually, those students probably should be coming into university and interacting with people. These may be introverts. These may be the students who we should be encouraging to work with other people. So we need to be careful that we don't go too far towards the online environment. But this flexibility to be able to plan their time and schedule their own time was important. They also suggested that if we moved the lecture content online, we could change the way we teach on campus. So we could have more workshop time, more tutorial time. We could have more smaller classes. All these things would be beneficial to the students, but actually quite time consuming for staff. So again, we need to be careful there. For the students who weren't in favour, they were saying things like, issues around access to resources, laptops, the internet, causing big problems everywhere, as we've seen here today. You can't guarantee that you're going to have good access. And it can be negatively impacting on motivation. So having face-to-face learning and discussion with lecturers and students is more beneficial than actually sitting at home and looking at a screen all day. Not having that personal contact would be a bad thing. So we need to make sure we maintain that personal contact, but maybe the lectures can still stay online. So these were the key things that we learned, right? As I've said, breaking up the lectures into smaller segments and putting quiz questions in was very well received by our students. The talking head was also favoured. It helped them to feel more involved. It made it feel more like a lecture, and it made them sort of get a connection with the staff member. Like I say, there was one student who said it was nice the teacher was present. At a time when we were teaching online, this was really important to our students to maintain that sense of connection with the university. So in future, I think we're going to have to use this information now to explore further what we do with our lectures. We should move more towards a flipped teaching model, where we generally make the lecture material available online, as we have done here, but we're freeing up our precious face-to-face time to do more constructive, active learning. So I'm not suggesting that we take away face-to-face time. This is the classic model of flipped teaching. We take the lecture material and put that online, and then we use our expertise and skills as teachers to support our students in the face-to-face sessions more effectively. And I've been saying this for quite a long time, but now I have a lot of colleagues saying to me, oh, this is a good idea, we should do this. So this is an exciting time for exploring new ideas. So I just thought that's a good place really to finish. I've shared with you some of the things that we did just on 20 minutes. And I've just put those questions there. I was just thinking some of the things that I've been thinking about that might be interesting questions for you to think about. But that's probably a good time for me to finish. So thank you very much for having me today. It's been great to talk to you.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.